Not coming. Who knows? Whatever. Your screen. Okay. All right. Let's see which of these guys wants to. Good thing there's nobody else in this classroom today. What's that? Oh, no. Okay. Yeah, you're fine.
How are you liking Fox so far?
Fox is usually a little more organized than this. Yeah, this has never had, this is my 11th course and I've never had this happen. So that's fun. I don't know what that means. Yeah, there's a first time for everything. And we've had some weird stuff in this class. We've had a llama. We've had some inmates. But I've never been locked out of my own classroom. So that is new. That's okay. We can be flexible. We have a classroom and we're not teaching outside because it's going to be dark soon. As much fun as that would be. What am I doing? I'm getting my bearings. That's what I'm doing. So, fundamentals of government. Today's going to be a lot of lecture. Tried to add in some discussion to make it less boring because it is a lot of that really sort of dense foundational material. Everybody see that okay? Are those lights good? Yeah. All right, cool. Another thing on Canvas, there's a new module that says resources. There are two things on there. One of the graduate professors made a video presentation on writing in APA style. So for folks who maybe don't have a lot of experience for that, for my first year students, take a look at that. If you prefer learning by video, that is there as opposed to like going to the writing center or something. Also, another one of your classmates shared a video about data and ways to improve data in law enforcement, and kind of like we talked about 2 weeks ago, sort of finding a way to appropriately use data in ways that are actually valid, scientifically valid in law enforcement. So that's on there too if anybody wants to take a look. So review. How do I make this? There we go. This is what we're doing today for the first half of today. We're going to jump around a little bit because your book doesn't go into a ton of detail. We're also going to talk about some Oregon-specific things that your book doesn't address. By the way, they did just publish a 5th edition of the book. So those 4th editions should be cheaper now. If you haven't bought it already, you should do that. Yeah, am I getting creeped on? Are you TikToking me? Is that what they call it? Did everybody sign in? Already got the sign-in sheet? Is anyone else sign? You can put me on the internet. I'm sure. Put myself on the internet and can't be any more embarrassed with that already. So these were our class agreements. Everyone's still cool with these? Anything anybody wants to add? Okay, that was awkward. What was that about?
It was just there's only 4 of them.
There are only 4 of them. You guys are quiet. Yeah, last year's, was like 2 columns with all sorts of stuff. So that's it. Those are our rules. And other than that, anything goes? Okay, we can add to it as we go. This is the only time we're going to review it. Yeah. Oh, it's dinner time. So in my mind, like if you need to eat, you should eat. Like I would rather you be here and eat food than like pass out because your blood sugar is low. Yeah, I mean, don't like bring in a hot plate and start like grilling. But yes, please bring food if you are hungry. It is dinner time. So also you're in college, like you should just bring food. So we're going to talk about our new friends, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. We're going to talk about some big picture stuff, some critical theory, all those kinds of big picture philosophical questions about why our government is set up the way that it is, why our criminal justice system is set up the way that it is, who's in charge and why, how we define crime and why, those kinds of things to sort of kind of set the tone, right? These are the sort of critical questions we want to ask as we go through the rest of the course and we talk about more specific, like nitty-gritty things, like what happens at an arraignment or what happens at sentencing or what is a PO's job, right? We're going to keep things in mind around those smaller issues to kind of, have that big umbrella of stuff. So the two main theories that you read about are consensus and conflict theories. Everyone read about these, yeah? Does anybody remember who was all about consensus theory? Which of our three, I'll give you a hint, it was two of them, felt really strongly around society being formed on the basis of consensus? Anybody? These are on Canvas, by the way, or at least they should be.
When you go to the first foundations of moral time,
That's second half of class. Did I not post this one?
I don't.
Okay, well let's do that. Sometimes I post things and you also have to make it visible. And there's a good chance I did that. Or I took it down because I found a typo. Oh, that's another thing. And I don't think I put this in the syllabus, but if you find a typo and you point it out, you get a bonus point. Or any kind of mistake. If I make a mistake and you find it, you get credit for that. Because it is not your job to proofread my stuff, but if you do, you get some credit. Let's see here. Hey, look at that. It's not there. That's fun. Did I upload it? Nope. Let's play a fun game called What Kinds of Things Are in Liz's Downloads folder. That's a good time for everyone. Hey. Bam. Okay, it's there now. I'm good at stuff. Right. So, which two philosophers that you read were all about consensus theory, or essentially formed consensus theory? Give you a hint, it goes a lot faster if you tell me instead of me waiting and staring awkwardly into the void and then telling you. Anybody want to guess? You got 3 guesses, right? And 2 out of 3 of them are correct. So there's a good chance you're going to guess right. Hobbes. Yes. Hobbes is one. Who's the other? You got a 50-50 chance. Yeah? No, nope, nope. Try again. Not you, somebody else. Yeah. Yep. So Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. So these are 2 fellows that are pretty early on. How do I make this go somewhere, literally anywhere else? Bye. Nope, maybe not. No, I can't move you away. Okay, fine. And then Rousseau talked about conflict theory. The idea with conflict theory here is that there are going to be competing interests inherent to any kind of society. There are always going to be differences, and that part of forming a civil society is working with those differences and setting them up in opposition to each other, but in a way that makes sense, right? So some examples. We always have a prosecution and defense. We need both of those, at least in our court system, to have a functioning court system. You know, we have to balance the victim's rights and the rights of the accused. We need both. Those kinds of things. So it's a little more dialectical and less dichotomous than the idea of consensus theory. Both are useful though. Consensus theory is the idea that crime is really anything that goes against what we as a society have decided. And that's where a lot of the debates come in, right? When we talk about things like certain types of legislation, people have a consensus on what is considered to be right versus wrong. And when we don't have that consensus, that's where conflict comes up. The example that Rousseau uses quite a bit is around class. Again, keeping in mind that this is, hundreds of years ago, and that was a really, really big deal, right? So we've got these folks that are coming over from England, coming from Europe. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is from France, and they're seeing civil wars. They're seeing the war for independence. They're seeing all of those things happening. And so the idea of competing class interests was very, very much prevalent and really influenced how these gentlemen were thinking. Let's talk about Roy Hobbes here with his sweet skullet. So Hobbes is English. He is of the artisan class. So he's kind of in that middle class when it still existed at that point, kind of prior to industrialization. So he is pre-industrial, pretty early philosopher when it comes to modern government. So there were earlier philosophies that were very, very much spiritualist in view. Does anyone know what nominalism is? It's okay if you don't. So nominalism is essentially a philosophy in which, so you're all familiar kind of with the Age of Reason and sort of going from a more spiritualist view to what we would consider the scientific method. So nominalism is the idea that universal abstract concepts need to have a name. They need to have some sort of concrete name in order to actually exist. And that in order for something to exist or be talked about in any kind of meaningful way, it has to fit into language, which was different than previous philosophies. Materialism takes that a little farther. Materialism says that nothing exists except for matter and its movement and its modifications. So with materialism, we're not talking about things like, separation between soul and body or those sorts of earlier philosophies. Thomas Hobbes is one of the first philosophers that talked about essentially this idea of modern scientific theory that says we have to be able to actually observe something, we have to be able to touch it, we have to be able to see it in order to talk about it in some kind of meaningful way. Which then leads us to empiricism. Empiricism is the idea that we have to be able to measure things. This is a theory that all knowledge, including spiritual knowledge and philosophical knowledge, is derived from things that we can observe. So instead of just sitting around and thinking about human behavior, Hobbes really pushed this idea that first we should observe human behavior and then make conclusions about it rather than the other way around, which had been, for us seems a little like common sense, but that was the prevailing philosophy at the time. So you'll notice that even in his writings, that shows up, right? So he starts off with these postulates, he starts off with these ideas, and he says, okay, if we accept X, Y, Z, then we need to have conclusions based on those observations. So he starts out making a lot of observations about human nature. A lot of those observations are flawed because it's, 1600s, but it's the same sort of idea of, okay, we're going to start with observations and then we're going to draw conclusions based on those observations, as opposed to having a belief and looking for evidence for it, kind of the other way around. Does that make sense? So our boy Hobbes with the skullet, he's seeing a lot of stuff going on. Up until then, there was this idea that kings had divine right and that all leadership was derived from God, that it came from, some sort of divine decision making, right? So if you were a king, it's because God chose you, and then you were born into that family and you were supposed to be there. So Hobbes realizes like, okay, well, that doesn't really seem to be working because we just chopped this dude's head off. So clearly civil society is not going the direction it's supposed to be going. And a lot of people started questioning the idea of divine rights of kings and the idea that, lordships and all of these landholders were somehow inherently better than everyone, that they were somehow chosen to be superior and everyone else was supposed to follow them. So he sort of rejected that idea and instead came up with this idea of social contract. And social contract theory, which you read about, is all around this idea that people participate in society in exchange for something else, right? Not because God said, hey, you're going to be a peasant and you're going to be a lord, tough shit, that's how it is, but rather that there's some sort of exchange happening there. So he's not talking so much like, okay, people are in their position because it's their fault, because this is what they chose. He's talking purely about sort of this more abstract concept of you are in a society and the society is set up this way because of some sort of social contract. I exchange my labor in exchange for land and money or food or whatever, right? We exchange things like certain liberties in exchange for safety, which we're going to talk about a little bit with Locke. Those are all examples of social contracts. We're engaging in a social contract right now. I'm the teacher, I'm talking, you're all sitting here pretending to listen, and that's the expected behavior because that's what you signed up for, right? That's kind of the inherent thing that we know we're supposed to do because that's what we're taught. That is our social contract. So he had some, some iffy feelings about this whole idea, right? So he sees Charles get beheaded firsthand. He's there, he's in the crowd, like, woo, yay, it's a beheading, everybody show up, it's a party. So that pretty much, he didn't love that. He didn't believe that people should overthrow their government. He thought that they should try to maintain the status quo and make changes in very sort of small stepwise ways, because he felt that without government, there would be complete and total utter chaos. He did, however, favor safety and security over liberty, which is something you probably hear people still talking about now, right? You've heard conversations around things like certain surveillance programs where people have those debates over how much of their freedom, how much of their privacy they're willing to exchange for safety or perceived safety. So this is a really, really long-standing debate. And Hobbes is one of those people that you could definitely cite when you're thinking about those things. So you read all this in Leviathan. Somebody want to translate this into 21st century speak? What do you want to give it a go? You're not going to be wrong. It's difficult, but how did you interpret this? This is kind of his whole thesis. Also, you don't get credit for typos on this because they're not typos, because people spelled things differently in the 1600s. Did anybody understand what they read? Yeah, nobody just wants to share. Did anybody spark notes it? It's okay to, like, you know, look up other things that say, like, hey, this is what this means. I'm going to share the Spark Notes version. I'm getting some really good expressions. I'm getting some, like, faces from some people, and I'm getting some, like, scared faces, and I'm getting some, like, are you kidding me faces? But this goes faster if you do the thing. Please don't make me call on random people. Somebody pick a number from 1 to 100. Well, you made eye contact. What's your name? No, not you. You're Cedar, right? Who are you? Emerson. You made eye contact. Give me a number 1 to 100. Okay, you in the plaid. Give me a number 1 to 100. You also made eye contact. Social contract, right? That's communication. Number was 33. Emerson, you're up. Tell me what that says. Sorry. Yeah, put it in your own word. And you don't have to do it word for word. Just give me a sentence or two that says, what did you get out of what Hobbes wrote here?
Families on both fronts better. Rather than this person's thoughts and all important.
Yeah, he definitely had this feeling that, you know, you have what you have and somebody else can come along and take it, right? You're on the right track there. So what do you think it was about his life and the things that he witnessed that led him to these beliefs, right? This idea of, like, okay, you have land, you have liberty, you have certain possessions, you have family, you have food, but someone else might come along and take it. And the only reason that that's not happening all the time is because for some reason, as a society, we've agreed that you get to keep your land and I get to keep my land, and I'm not going to steal yours unless we have some sort of, you know, whatever valid reason they considered. Where do you think that came from? What's your name? Sarah? Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I mean, he was in the middle, you know, he came up with these ideas in the middle of a civil war. He saw the king get beheaded. He saw a complete takeover and essentially a lot of chaos in civil society reforming itself. So what we want to look at here is how, you know, when we talk about, you know, founding fathers and the philosophers that influenced them and the people who wrote the Constitution, we really want to keep in mind the fact that they were human beings, right? That they had certain experiences, that they led certain lives in certain eras, and that influenced their thinking, right? It influenced the things that they considered to be fundamental truths. So for Hobbes, it is a fundamental truth that that equality is there to achieve an end, and that the fear of loss, right? The fear of loss of property, the fear of loss of life, the fear of loss of liberty is what drives people to engage in a consensus, to form a society, and to agree. Like, okay, you keep yours, I keep mine, everybody's happy, right? So he also says here at the bottom, and by consequence, such augmentation of dominion over men being necessary to man's conservation, it ought to be allowed him. So essentially, any government that is there to protect liberty, property, life, so on and so forth, keep the peace, he's saying that people should then agree to engage in that government. So the citizens are agreeing, right? That's where the social contract comes in. Got our friend John over here, John Locke. He's a little livery. He's got some liver stuff going on. Might just be the lighting, I don't know. But so he took things a little bit further. He started off by really questioning religion, which was normal at the time again. So we're seeing the rise of the age of reason. We're seeing a rise of scientific theory and this idea of materialism, this idea of empiricism, this idea that we should be only really looking at things that are testable, observable, things that are a little more concrete, less abstract. So he took it a step further and said, okay, if we're going to question religion, we should really be questioning all authority. So he had this belief that we should be tolerating various religions instead of having the government control one religion over the other, which, as you can imagine, at the time was extremely contentious. He believed that you couldn't compel people using violence, that you could control people using violence, but you couldn't actually change people's beliefs using violence and control, especially around things like religion and philosophy and ways of living. He agreed with Hobbes that the role of the state was to ensure safety and preservation of property. So the state meaning the government, local government, large government, whatever, essentially leadership. And again, that without government, people would return to a state of nature. So he, interestingly enough, had some, despite his sort of questioning of hierarchy and hierarchical structures, he did have this belief that government was a lot like a family in which, the government serves like a parent and we are all its children and its job is to keep us safe and all that kind of stuff. And also that it's mutually beneficial. He saw it like a marriage where you have one person at the time who provided and another person who provided something back. And this, again, was meant to be mutually beneficial. And that is necessary as long as it remains mutually beneficial. He believed very strongly that as soon as it stopped being beneficial, that people were not obligated to participate, which was different than Hobbes. He also had a difference in that he believed that all leaders were ruled by the same forces of nature as others. So in one of the chapters that you read, he goes on and on and on about the state of nature. And it's this really just kind of interesting beliefs around what human beings would be naturally. There's some classism in there. There's some racism in there. He's very much a product of his time and what he believed human beings would be without certain types of government, without certain types of authority. So here's one of his long rambling paragraphs about that. Anybody want to give this one a go? Harry, you had your name tag out, so I'm going to call on you. Because you're the only person who remembers your name tag. Yeah, some of you guys left your name tags. They're kind of like, I don't know who to hand them to. So I'm just going to give them to random people and you're just going to have new names because I don't know who you are. That's the whole point of the name tags. No? All right, you want to pass it off? Pick somebody else. No pressure. So let's do it sentence by sentence. So we've got people, they're in a state of nature. They are, as he considered to be, heathens and hooligans and savages and blah, blah, blah. He likes the word savage. There's a lot of really heavy connotations around that. Keep in mind, this is also sort of at the height of colonialism. So this idea of savage is really prevalent with Locke. And a lot of the thinking at the time was also there to sort of justify things like colonialism. Like, see, we're helping these people by, doing all these things, but we shouldn't do it violently, right? Like it was a lot of cognitive dissonance between what some of these folks believed and what they were actually doing and supporting. So he starts off here talking about, okay, so we've got these people that are in a state of nature, they are savages, and they decide to unite into a community. And in order to do that, they have to give up certain power. Does that make sense? So if you have this land and I want that land, instead of just killing each other and deciding who gets to keep the land that way, we instead have to come to some sort of agreement or we take it in front of a judge and the judge decides, right? There's an authority figure that decides. The idea of land ownership at all implies some sort of authority. There are a lot of societies that don't believe in land ownership and see the land as something that's alive and not something that we own, but rather something we have a relationship with. So there's still this idea of authority and power that is inherent with Locke. And he believes essentially, so he's saying that they agree to unite into a society and that it has to be between every single person that participates, right? There has to be consensus. That's where that consensus theory comes from. And essentially that, so and thus that which begins and actually constitutes any political society, blah, 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 blah. Basically that the whole of society is made up by adding up all of the individual parts. And that if any of those individual parts changes or moves, then the whole of society is going to change or move because it is, it is the addition of those parts. Does that make sense? And he also believes, this last sentence is interesting, he says that is the only way in which we can create a lawful government so that other types of government weren't considered valid to Locke and to other folks of his time, as opposed to things like creating government by force or creating government by coercion, right? Rousseau's an interesting fellow. Has anyone read anything by Rousseau before? He's a little more around. No? Rousseau wrote a really, really interesting autobiography that I would encourage everyone to read. He was not shy about his vices and the people that inspired his vices, like his aunt. Really interesting stuff and lots of detail, especially for the time period. So he kind of took an opposite approach, and he believed that the state of nature was much more idyllic and that people were naturally good rather than naturally savage. So a little bit different from our other two. He also felt that conflicts of interest were arise and that these were based on natural inequalities, and things that he considered to be natural inequalities were things like having different skills, different talents, different body sizes, different abilities. You're really good at farming. Well, I'm really good at hunting and gathering, and I'm really good at taking care of sheep. So we are all going to get together. And because we have those differences, right, because we have these inherent qualities, we can form a society because we need people to be different to have a functioning society, right? We need somebody who's good at growing corn. We also need somebody who's good at herding sheep. And he saw those fundamental differences as not a bad thing, but as sort of naturally occurring and necessary to have a healthy society. He agreed with Locke when it comes to issues of property. So private property becomes really important, and he agreed with Locke that the role of government was to protect individual rights when it comes to things like property, life, liberty, so on and so forth. He disagreed with Hobbes in particular on the nature of man. So he felt that society led to inequalities and that, yeah, people became that way and people had these inherent differences, but that those differences did not have to mean that there was inequality. He felt that differences should lead to equity, which is different than inequality. He believed that war and conflict arose as a result from inequality. He felt that part of government's role, in addition to protecting property, life, liberty, was also to decrease inequality. So for instance, if you have one person who comes and tries to steal your land, but you have, a little piece of paper that says this is your land, he believed the government should step in and say, no, that's that person's land. They've got the piece of paper, we have this authority, so on and so forth. He did not believe, unlike Hobbes, that it was just going to happen and whoever decided to conquest and take over, that now they win and it belongs to them. And not just with land, right? With all sorts of other ways of being when it comes to life, food, property, your children, all that kind of stuff. So he points out some pretty hard truths here for the time. He was influenced and influential in the French Revolution and in the American Revolution. You guys learn about the French Revolution in high school at some point, hopefully. The guillotines and let them eat cake and all that good stuff. Cool. So here he's talking about basically, up until that point, the law was useful in maintaining the status quo and that he didn't think it should be that way. He essentially pointed out like, well, the law is being used so far to benefit people that have possessions and kind of harmful to the people that don't. And then it's only advantageous to people who have. So he kind of was one of the first people to point out the haves and the have-nots. Here's an interesting one. In a well-governed state, there are few punishments, not because there are many pardons, but because criminality is rare. It is when a state is in decay that multitudes of crimes is a guarantee of impunity. So that's a big one. When we talk about, I think it's next week or the week after, we're going to talk about theories of crime and victimization. And what does that mean, right? What does it say about society if we have a lot of crime? What does it say about society if we're defining crime in such a way that it looks like we have a lot of crime, which are two kind of separate issues. And he believed that the social pact, so like it says here, the goal is to increase equality and to make up for whatever natural inherent inequalities were already there. So this is pretty revolutionary stuff for his period. What's the first sentence of your address? We believe these rights to be inalienable. You read that? Everybody read? Yeah. So kind of along the same lines, right? That everybody has certain rights that are supposed to lead to equality. So where did you see some of these philosophies showing up when you read the Constitution? Because you all read it. Some of it, you didn't read all of it. What's your name?
Yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. You know, we have three separate branches of government, the purpose of which is for there to sometimes be conflict, right? That conflict is inevitable, that the Supreme Court is sometimes going to disagree with the legislature, and that's part of their job. They're to interpret it, right? That sometimes different courts are going to agree, and that's why we have a Supreme Court, that sometimes the executive branch might overstep, and that's why we have a legislature, and vice versa, right? So there's definitely some conflict theory kind of inherent, especially in that first part of the Constitution where the founding fathers are writing about why they're setting it up that way into those three different branches. What else? What else did you see? What's your name?
The separation of church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, huge. Really, really big there. Our Constitution is the first. A huge part of our Constitution was influenced by the French Revolution, but our Constitution was the first to actually separate church and state and keep that very, very, very separate in terms of, again, not having divine right of kings, having a president that is voted in as opposed to sort of chosen by God, that kind of thing. How do you see some of these beliefs coming up in our current criminal justice system specifically? So thinking about crime, thinking about the political climate and what we consider to be crime. Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So there's this idea that if you commit a crime, you have a right to a jury of your peers, right? So, and they are meant to be representative of the rest of civil society. What else? Give me one more and then you can take a break. One more first though. No, nobody wants to take a break? Yeah, I want to take a break, so.
I think the really big one is ours, like.
Mhm. Absolutely. Absolutely. And we see that show up in criminal justice quite frequently, right? People will talk about like, well, is it okay for police to look through your phone? Is it okay for the FBI to monitor certain parts of the internet? Is it okay for certain countries in the world to survey their citizens just as kind of part of everyday life? And are we as a society willing to give up privacy in exchange for what we feel is safe? Yeah, that's a really big one. So let's take 5 minutes. And then we're going to talk about crime control and due process. And I'm going to call somebody about why our classroom is locked. Who wants to be in charge of reminding me to restart the recording? Anybody? Front row people? Awesome. Perfect. Yeah, we know. Pause. Okay. Oh, that's my face. Do that. We're gonna share our screen again. What did you ask?
What is like the biggest like? What do you get convicted for? So like, how do I say this? Like, you worked in like the security prison.
Yeah, I worked at the
And
pen.
so like, what criminal act did like was the most that been for there?
The penitentiary, because it's the max security, that was mostly murder, assault, rape, etc. We also held the mental health units, which is where I worked. So that could be a whole range of convictions. It really just depended on whether or not they could meet their needs in general population. So let's say you had a minimum security crime, but you had severe mental health needs. They'd ship you off to the pen to be on the mental health unit. So lots of interesting intermingling happening there, which we will definitely talk about when we get to the prison section. I've got at least one guy who's going to come in and talk to y'all, one of my former employees who got out last year.
Did you hear back from the superintendent?
No, they are ignoring me. But I'm going to continue to nag them. They're busy, so I get it. And they're probably like, who are you? You haven't worked here in 5 years. I have no idea who you are. Yeah. The superintendent that I did work for isn't there anymore because he slept with a manager, which is public knowledge. It was all over the news. So welcome to prison, friends. Yeah, shit happens. So that was fun for everyone. Crime control model. You read about this in your textbook. This one's pretty simple. The idea is that the ends always justify the means and that our goal should be to control crime at all costs. Somebody just came here on a golf cart. I hope that they're not going to unlock the classroom because I told her it's fine today. Nope, he's just checking stuff. Okay, that's fine. So in a crime control model, the accused are presumed guilty and have very few rights, and the focus is on factual guilt. Did you do the thing? Did we see you do the thing? Did you actually commit the crime? Primary goal here is to punish, the idea being that if we punish, it will deter crime. Does this work? What do your books say about how efficacious it is? It's a fun word. Thoughts? Can you think of examples where it might work or where it might not work? Mm-hmm.
I can think of it that I've read about in the usually you go to jail, you look into the again, get punished, but I don't think it's
Yeah. We also know that for a lot of very, very serious crimes, things like murder, crimes of passion, people aren't thinking about the consequences when they do them. We talk about certain types of property crimes. People tend to not be thinking about the consequences when they do them, right? You're hungry, you're starving, you steal some food. You're not thinking about going to jail. You're thinking about being hungry, right? You're in survival mode. There are people, however, who still sort of endorse this view, right? We have this belief that the death penalty, for instance, will keep people from engaging in crimes that result in death. You're laughing. Tell me about the laugh. Has it worked? Yeah, what does the research show? And that's really what the question should always be, is what does the research actually show? And it shows that it doesn't really work. And then at the end, we have the due process model. Sometimes this doesn't work either. We need to have a good balance. So here the focus is on legal guilt. Did the accused commit the specific crime that we're accusing them of, right? Let's say there's burglary 1, 2, and 3. If I'm the prosecutor, I had better choose the correct one of those 3, and I had better have the evidence to back it up. Because let's say they did steal something, but maybe the way that they stole it and what they stole is burglary 1, but I'm trying to get them for burglary 3, thrown out, innocent. So emphasis is not here on factual guilt. Did they actually steal the thing? It's on what specific thing did they do. Here, everyone's assumed innocent until proven guilty. You've heard that phrase before, right? That's our society. And that the means have to be fair. So this is where we see a lot of those things come up where, let's say that we get evidence, but we collected the evidence incorrectly or in a way that violates your civil rights, which we're going to talk about in a few weeks when we talk about police work and we talk about the Bill of Rights, 4th Amendment, 5th Amendment, rules of search and seizure, all that kind of stuff. The goal here is that things be fair and that things be impartial. So we're going to wait to decide that somebody's guilty until we actually have the evidence to prove it. So pros and cons to both models. The United States uses a little bit of both models depending on the jurisdiction, depending on the crime, the type of crime, those kinds of things. So here's a super fun situation. read through this and tell me what you do. Right, that whole be nice to each other thing. So like, don't, you know, like you can argue, but like, don't be mean. Who votes for torture the brother? Nobody? This is my first class where nobody says torture the brother. Okay, interesting. So yesterday was 9/11. When 9/11 happened and this exact scenario was presented, almost everybody raised their hand and said, yes, torture the brother. So that's the thing. Great example of how political climate and current issues affect how we perceive things, right? So nobody wants to torture brother to figure out where the terrorist is. Okay, everybody dies. Should you have tortured the brother?
Mhm.
Okay. What's that?
Put him on a polygraph.
Maybe. How do you do that? Has he committed a crime? Can we, go ahead. Yeah, he just happens to be related to Mr. Terrorist, right? And that is a tactic that we see used, right? We see that happen in these sorts of situations. So this is a due process issue. No matter what you do here, you're wrong. Somebody gets hurt, somebody dies, right? But this is a due process issue. Brother is captured and detained. The other questions you should be asking here is, where is this happening? Is this happening on United States soil? Is it happening somewhere else? Are they citizens? Are they not? Because we like to have different rules depending on different places. Who's at Guantanamo Bay right now? Lots of people awaiting trial who've never actually been charged or convicted. There are a few who have, but there are a few who aren't, and it's outside of jurisdiction. So, oops, too bad. Those are the sorts of things that you have to think about, is who does the Constitution apply to? When does it apply? And why do we make exceptions sometimes? Right? And there really aren't good answers to those questions. And those are the questions that we hear about on the news and that you hear, politicians debating. But those are the kind of things you want to think about. So attack happens and your boss says, why didn't you get the brother to tell you? What do you tell him?
Brother didn't do anything wrong to deserve investigation.
Yeah, say there was no crime committed. It was outside of my jurisdiction. Other thing people need to think about here is issues in civil court, which we're going to talk about. So this is a paper from a couple years ago now, 2006. So again, sort of culturally relevant for the time. In authoritarian states, criminal justice systems rely on a large enforcement and punishment apparatus. So essentially, in states where we have lots and lots and lots of heavy law enforcement, lots and lots of punishment, that is essentially an authoritarian state. And the United States, we don't want to be an authoritarian state. We are, what kind? Anybody know our setup of government? You read the Constitution. What are we? Technically not. Give me something more specific. Emerson? Yes, we are a democratic republic. So in a true democracy, everything would be popular vote. A democratic republic, just like ancient Greece, we are electing officials to go speak on our behalf, right? That's what your Congress is. Does everybody know who your congressmen are? Is anybody not registered to vote? Okay, we'll be bringing in some paperwork for you. So you should be registered to vote. Wait, you're not 18, right? Okay, you can still register. In Oregon, you can pre-register and then you will still get a ballot after your birthday. So, on the other hand, in a liberal democracy, the idea here is that we should be defending people's civil liberties and that you should have due process of the law. And that's really kind of how the United States functions most of the time. Sometimes it doesn't. I'm sure you can all think of cases when it doesn't. Compromise between those two is this idea of discretion. So, judges have lots and lots of discretion. If you choose not to have a jury trial, you get a bench trial. And that judge makes every single decision from start to finish about your conviction, about your sentencing, so on and so forth. Police get to use discretion. So if I'm driving around and if I see something a little shady, I get to decide if I'm an officer on patrol, whether or not I need to stop and do something about the shady thing that I'm seeing. What are some pros and cons?
Like a con of discretion is like, not everyone's gonna have perfect judgment,
Yeah.
especially police officers. And so they can be put in a situation where like their judgment, like to the general public was wrong.
Yeah, your judgment can be impaired. Absolutely. You might have seen something completely out of context. We see this a lot in the news, right? We see a video of something happening, but we only see 30 seconds of the video. We don't see all the before, we don't see all the after. So we're kind of primed to only believe certain things, but that can happen. You know, there could be a train wreck outside the window and every single one of you would have a different report about that train wreck. You know, if you're in a car and there's an accident, you're all sitting in different places. You would all have perceived the accident differently just because you're sitting in different places. So there can definitely be some issues there. What about some positives?
You don't have to abide by the letter.
Okay, tell me how that's a positive and when.
Well, in certain contexts, say that like, because it's one document, it's hard to apply that single document to every single situation in the entire world. So in certain contexts, when you need to not like for yourself, you can.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there needs to be some sort of flexibility, right? Anybody here from Polk County? Okay, tell me about your local law enforcement and government structure in Polk County. What's the kind of reputation, at least, that you've heard?
I feel like I hear most of them.
Yeah.
In Polk County.
As opposed to the large towns in Polk County?
Like, well, you don't, I don't think you're much.
Yeah.
I don't think I've heard anything.
Yeah. Polk County kind of has a reputation for being really, really tough on crime compared to Marion County. And it's like you cross a bridge, you might still be in Salem, for instance, but you're going to get treated a little bit differently. PO system is a little bit different. Judges are a little stricter. It's generally a little bit more of a crime control mindset than Marion County, the neighboring county. So for instance, I've got a kid right now that I work with who's 18 years old, just turned 18, and is being charged with a number of charges. Has been given a plea deal to plead down to burglary 1, 90 months, so about 7.5 years. Person who abused that kid sexually as a child only got 4 years. Different county. So a little bit of discretion used there, right? We've got essentially a teenager, right? Somebody your age whose brain isn't fully developed, who did something really, arguably really, really stupid. Maybe, we don't know yet. He might not even have been there, right? There's some cell phone videos, there's all sorts of sketchy stuff happening there. And he is African-American. He is pretty big for his age. He has a very deep voice. He can come off as very, very threatening to some people, even though he's 18 years old and he's a kid. So this kid, you know, he's a child, right? He has sat in my office and we've talked a lot and he is effectively a child, just turned 18. They could have chosen to not charge him as an adult because of when the thing happened. Okay, so the thing happened when he was 17. They could have charged him in juvenile court. In Oregon, you can get charged as a juvenile and stay in that system until you're 25, but they chose to charge them as an adult. That is an example of discretion, where you can really have a huge effect on somebody's life and the outcome of that case based on your very subjective decision-making, right? So lots of things that could go wrong there. And there are other people who would argue that that's a good thing, right? Like, oh, we're gonna be tough on crime, you know? Just really depends. Depends on your perspective, depends on your beliefs, depends on your cultural beliefs, your cultural assumptions, all those kinds of things. So, anybody know what a logistic regression model is? You probably won't. We talked about this a few weeks ago. Like if you haven't taken statistics yet or research methods yet, you won't. But it is essentially one of the more valid ways of looking at data. So instead of just doing a correlation, it's one of the better ways to try to actually establish causality. So that's how we know that this is a fairly strong study. So what they found is when they measured all different variables, that the actual offense was one of the least significant predictors of how the officers in various situations would act were situational factors. And this included all kinds of things, right? Number of people around, the weather, the time of day, the shift, all different types of things here. Really interesting study if anybody wants to read it. Yeah. The biggest one was what? What was the biggest factor here? It's right in the middle. second sentence. What was most likely to affect whether or not people got charged? Yep. Supporting it, demarcating demeanor. So perceived disrespect and noncompliance. So those are the things to pay attention to, right? You get arrested, be really, really, really nice. You know, don't be like, oh, Liz, my criminal justice professor said that I have Fourth Amendment rights, because they're going to laugh at you and they're going to arrest you. Might be true that you have those rights, but, you know, have some tact about it. All right. We kind of already answered these questions, so we'll skip that. Wedding cake model. This is a diagram from your book. It looks different in the new. They use different colors in the new edition. That's really what you're paying for. So. In our scenario with Mr. Terrorist, let's say it's a different kind of situation. Let's say it's something like trespassing. And we've got a witness and we really, really want to know whether or not our friend Mr. trespassed. Would that change your view on the tactics you're going to use, as opposed to, say, a witness of a murder or a witness of a rape or some other sort of more serious, like a Measure 11 mandatory sentence charge? Would that matter? You can be honest. Yeah, if someone's nodding, right? And that's okay, right? That is an example of a good use of discretion, depending on the seriousness of the crime, right? So if I'm dealing with like Mr. Homeless who's hanging out in the stairwell because it's freezing outside, I'm probably not going to use the same interrogation tactics that I'm going to use for the person that was just brought in because he stabbed somebody, right? One of those is a little bit different, and I'm going to be more willing to charge one over the other. So that's an example of a time that you might use your discretion. And maybe you wouldn't. Maybe you'd be like, you know, fuck Mr. Homeless. Go be outside. It's cool. Whatever, right? You can complain about me swearing. It won't be the first time. I actually got that in one of my reviews. They're like, she swears. And I'm like, you want to be a cop. Good luck. Godspeed. And that's okay, right? That is your choice. You get to have that discretion if you are the officer in that situation. If you're the prosecutor in that situation, you're going to be like, hey, Mr. Officer, stop wasting my time. Or you might not. It just depends on your values, your training, your education, your experience, all those kinds of things. Another thing that we see this show up a lot is in police reports. So I've probably seen dozens of police reports where it will say, based on my training, education, and experience, so-and-so appeared intoxicated. Or based on my training, education, experience, so-and-so appeared to be dealing with a mental illness, right? And then they'll say, therefore, I chose to take them to the hospital instead of to the jail. Or therefore, I chose to take them to the detox center instead of the jail. Or therefore, we chose to have EMTs come assess them to make sure they were safe to come to jail, right? So they're using discretion in ways that are good. So it's not always all bad, right? This is not a we hate cops class. This is a let's talk about the pros and cons and figure out when it's appropriate, when it's not appropriate. You know, figure out your own style kind of thing. What are some examples of some big cases that have led to changes in legislation? And how has that gone? There's one in your book. Does anybody remember? Didn't read the book because you were really, really into Hobbes and Rousseau?
What? The book talked a lot about this.
Yeah, so J. Simpson and then Cedar, you were going to say the same thing? Yep. So what legislation change happened after the O.J. Simpson trial, or charges, convictions, etc.? Nobody. All right, we'll leave that one empty for now because I don't remember. And I don't think that was the case that they were talking about for this particular instance. Anybody ever hear poly class? Has everyone heard of the 3 strikes law? Interesting. Poly class is the little girl who, there's a fellow in the neighborhood who had a history of assault and sexual assault, was released and broke into a sleepover, grabbed a little 11-year-old girl and assaulted her. Her name is Polly Klaas, and it's really fascinating to me that everybody knows about the 3 strikes rule, but nobody knows the name of the victim. It's kind of just a weird thing. So that led to the three strikes law. Not some great consequences with the three strikes law. The idea here is that you get 3 felonies, you're in prison for life. They didn't differentiate between types of felonies, right? They didn't differentiate between things like property felonies versus person felonies or drug felonies. So now we have a lot of people in prison, which you're going to read about in New Jim Crow, who maybe have never actually hurt anyone, but who are in prison for life because of that 3 strikes law. So on the other hand, we have lots of people in prison who might be hurting people, but who aren't getting out because of that 3 strikes law. So we have to take both of those sort of extremes into account. We already took a break. That's my dog. Cool. She's old. Let's talk about, what are we whispering about?
The 3 strikes law that originated in California.
Yes. Yep. That is where the polyclass case was. Have you guys seen Elf? Will Ferrell? It's like, I like to whisper too. This is not, we just did this. That's not what I want. Did I upload the wrong one? Nope, there it is. Hey. So your book does some funky stuff, like some of the stuff that we just did should really be in this section, but you know, I didn't write it, so. We're gonna go backwards again and talk about some historical stuff. So, English common law and other ancient laws. So the oldest known law is from this guy that I can't pronounce at all. Anybody want to give it a go? Yeah, I don't know. I have no idea. Out loud? It's a really fun word to say. Just do it. You're smirking. What's your name?
Justin.
Dustin? How would you pronounce that? That's fine. I mean, I honestly don't know how to say it, but like, okay, we can just say the current oldest known reform document. So we don't have the original, but there are later documents that reference essentially this very, very first ever found actual legal document, focused entirely on social reform and equity for poor, especially widows and children. So let's look at the time period. Why do you think that equity for widows and children is really, really important? You know, 2,500 years, 2,300 years BC. What's going on then? Is society like a pleasant thing to live in? Yeah. What happens if you get widowed? What's that? Yeah. I mean, well, that's later. That's like 14th. That's 12th century to 15th century. At this point, you know, nature-based and other sort of pre-Christian religions are prominent and accepted, so we're not really burning witches yet. That comes later. So at this point, we are in a very, very patriarchal society. We are in a society where only certain people are able to provide certain things. So if you get widowed, you're basically shit out of luck. All right, most of you read the Old Testament. What happens if you get widowed?
Like Mary.
Yeah, if you're lucky, you know, they are obligated to take care of you. If they don't have a brother, you're shit out of luck. Yeah. You're probably not going to be poor for very long because you are going to starve and you're going to die. So one of the first examples of law that we've ever found documented is this idea that we should do something about that, and maybe it shouldn't be that way. It also limited the power of the priesthood and of landowners. So even very, very early on, we've got documents that are sort of questioning this idea of innate, all-encompassing authoritarian power. Oops. Go away. Is there a way to make this go away? Like, I don't think there is. I think it just lives here. It's weird. You know, we've been doing this for like 4 years now with the whole Zoom thing, and like it just, whatever. Then we got this guy a little later, about 1,000 years later. Lots and lots and lots of documents here, but only found a few at a time. And the reason we know that others likely exist is because many of the documents we found are copies of each other, which says that not only do we have a law that's in writing and we're documenting it, we're using written history to document it, but we're making copies, which means we're disseminating it among other people. You know, we don't just have one centralized government here, we're actually sharing that law with other parts of the government. And that's a pretty big deal, at least at the time. This is where we first get the idea of an eye for an eye, a tooth for the tooth. You've probably seen it in the Bible, but it actually comes much, much earlier than that in this particular document. This is also where we see this idea of divine right show up for the first time. So Hammurabi, you can watch videos and every single person in every single video is going to pronounce it differently. I like to say Harambe because, you know, the monkey and he was awesome. So Harambe of Babylon. The belief here is that this code, and if we look at what's happening in society here, we're seeing the rise of city-states and we're seeing this idea of demigods. So demigods are the leaders of city-states, and because they are the leader of city-states, they get all the land, you have to work on my land, and I'm here because God sent me to be here. And as a result, I'm also some sort of demigod myself, because this, again, is pre-Christian, you know, 1700 years pre-Christianity, before Christ. So we still have people that are seeing kings and leaders of city-states arising, and because they have that power, they are seen as demigod-like figures. And they codify that by saying, well, here are the rules that God gave me, therefore you have to follow them. What else does that sound like? What other laws or rules do we have that are, what's that? Yeah, it's like the 10 Commandments, essentially the exact same story. You have to follow these rules because God gave them to me. It's on a tablet, etched it in there with my little chisel, you know. And that is our next example of ancient law. Then we get to English common law. This is the first time where we start to really see some kind of hierarchical court system. So instead of just, you know, you have a king and everybody follows what the king says, or else now we're going to start establishing this idea of magistrates or traveling judges. This is also where we see the first example of precedence, aka stare decisis, which is Latin for stand by things settled. What that means is that if one judge makes a decision, the other judges are probably going to follow it, unless there are different circumstances or they all get together and decide we don't like that, right? That's what the Supreme Court does. It looks at precedents. It says, here's how the law has been interpreted in the past. Based on that precedent, how should we interpret this new law? So this really formed the basis for our court system here. We have a municipal court, then we have a county, then we have a state, then we have a district, then we have the Supreme Court, which you don't have to know that right now because it'll be something we talk about when we talk about courts, but pretty old, 12th century. There you go. This is also from your book. Any questions about our courts? Does anybody know what district court Oregon is in? Hear about it on the news, listen to NPR because you're old like me and listen to NPR. OPB on the radio in the morning. Yeah. You really should, it's great. Anybody know what district court you're in? You've heard things on the news like, oh, blank Circuit Court of Appeals has decided blank about this. Which one is that? No. Yeah. Yes, Oregon, Washington, and there's a little map here. You are in the 9th Circuit. Notice that these are really, really, really different in size. Why do you think that is? Yes. Yep. They were also established a really long time ago, before there were millions of people living in places like California and Seattle and all those kinds of things, right? You also notice that they're numbered sort of based on when they became established. So obviously we settle in one area, that's our first district court, and we're going to kind of work our way down from there. Where are we at here? I stopped looking at my notes a while ago. Federalism. Has anyone read The Federalist? Yeah, John Grisham stuff. So federalism is basically this idea that we are going to have multiple layers of government and therefore multiple layers of court systems. For a long time, we had a Federalist Party. So in a land before time, before we just had Democrats, Republicans, and a few small parties, we had the Whigs Party and the Federalist Party and all sorts of other parties. So some terms here that you should know because you're going to see them pop up, and I don't expect you to memorize these, but just so you kind of know the difference. Statutes are laws enacted by Congress or legislature. So we're going to talk about, for instance, Oregon revised statutes, that anytime you see an ORS, an Oregon revised statute, what you can take from that is, you know, it was written by the legislature. Our state legislature wrote that law. A code or ordinance is something from a local body. So Eugene Municipal Code. You're not following the city ordinances, go clean up your yard, that kind of stuff. How would you decide what to charge? Let's say you are a city officer and we've got some disorderly conduct going on. Are you going to charge with the city ordinance disorderly conduct or the state ORS disorderly conduct? Okay, how come?
You're employed by the city.
Okay, maybe. That seems kind of like an intuitive answer, right? What if it's like really, really disorderly? What are some things that you would need to think about in terms of whether or not you're actually going to get a conviction for this person, what the consequences are going to be? What are some of those factors? So there's some logistic stuff. Maybe you're from a really, really small town and you don't have a really robust court system. Maybe the judge doesn't have time for this kind of stuff, in which case I'm probably going to use a county law and they're going to go to the county instead. Majority of crimes, majority of serious crimes end up going to the county because city municipal courts typically deal with like traffic and those sort of kind of like smaller citation type things, crap all over your lawn, garage door up, you know, that sort of stupid stuff. Serious stuff, but really kind of stupid stuff. You're not going to go to county because of a traffic violation unless it goes to the level of something like a DUI, something that's actually, you know, legislated by the state. Every now and then we do have some cities that have really, really robust courts. Eugene, for example, has a very, very robust municipal court. So like I would have cases come across my desk that were from Eugene. And I'm like, well, that's weird. Why are you at the state hospital when you got trespassing for the city of Eugene? And oftentimes the court will say, well, we don't want to deal with this, so we're going to push it up to the county because the county has the resources, the county has the time. Yeah. Federal law. So a couple different types here. The Constitution takes precedent over every single other thing, including the state constitutions. What happens if you have two states that have something in their constitutions that contradict each other? Who decides what to do there? Any ideas? What'd you read in the Constitution? So we got three branches of government, right? Which one is in charge of interpreting differences between constitutions? Mm-hmm. Yep, what's that? No, okay. Yeah, so somebody said Supreme Court. We also have other types of not really legislative laws. We have administrative laws. So we do have federal regulatory agencies, things like OSHA, EPA, so on and so forth. And then we have federal common law. And this is, again, that interpretation piece. What's a big one right now that you're hearing about all over the news and with election season gearing up? When it comes to state law, state constitution, Supreme Court case. Emerson? Yep. Yep, so abortion is a really, really, really big one. We had, for the first time, like in a very, very long time, had a Supreme Court overturn a previous Supreme Court decision, and it has led to complete catastrophe between states because now every single state gets to change their constitution and make their own law. And also we're seeing something for the first time, well, not the first time since before the Civil War, where states are saying, hey, you neighboring state, just because your law says this, our law says that, so we're going to prosecute people who go to your state who do this thing. The last time that happened was during slavery. So this is a pretty big deal in terms of the precedents that it will set for future decisions, regardless of whether or not you agree with, whether or not you're on the pro-choice side, the pro-life side, it doesn't really matter. The way that this is going to play out in the Supreme Court is going to have huge, huge, huge rippling effects because we're seeing state governments do things that they haven't done in a very, very long time. And that for the last 150 years, they've been told that they can't do. So something to pay attention to. That is an example of common law. State law. So same kind of examples here. Same crime, different things. Could you be charged with both? What do you think? Everybody ever heard double jeopardy? Yeah, so no, you cannot be charged with both. This is again one of those things where you would use your discretion and decide where's it going to go. It can be switched to a different court, but you wouldn't be able to have both charges in both courts at the same time for the same incident. Criminal law versus civil law. So obviously in this class, we're going to be talking mostly about criminal law, but you should know how civil law works as well, because there often is confusion, right? We'll see things happen where maybe somebody doesn't get convicted of the crime, but then we see it show up in civil court, wrongful death suits, those kinds of things. Totally different court systems, different judges, different processes, different penalties, all of that. There is a really, really, really useful chart in your book that essentially, where'd it go? No, why isn't it there? Oh no. Did I move it? Ha, there it is. So, burden of proof. With criminal, it has to be beyond a reasonable doubt. The evidence has to 100% support, and there cannot be any doubt whatsoever. In civil court, there's the preponderance of the evidence. The way that this has been interpreted historically is 50% plus a feather. So folks have seen the little scales of justice thing. Some lawyers have them on their desks. That's really what that's referring to, is this idea that if the scales are weighted a little bit in one direction, then that's the side that wins in civil court, as opposed to criminal court where it has to be all or nothing. Other differences here, private versus public. So civil court is usually used to address private issues. So if you get married or divorced, that's civil court. Child support stuff, civil court. Suing somebody, civil court. Disputes between businesses, all of those are civil court. Unless it rises to the level of some sort of crime. The difference is that with civil court, you have two different people filing suit against each other. Whereas with criminal court, the government is filing the suit against you. Your paperwork will say State of Oregon versus Liz, as opposed to Emerson versus Liz, because she calls on me all the time and I don't like being singled out. Different court system, right? You're just right in my line of sight, I'm sorry. And I know your name. It just is what it is. That's why everyone needs to bring their name tags back. Okay, we already talked about that. Other difference here is penalties. So criminal law, you're going to prison or jail. You might get a monetary fine. You might have community-based punishment, which is things like probation, parole, community service. In civil court, your penalties are usually going to be financial or some sort of making up for whatever it is that you did. So here, the plaintiff, the person who brings the lawsuit, they have the burden of proof. Anybody can bring a lawsuit in civil court. Probably better to have an attorney so that you're more likely to win, but any single one of you could go online and go onto your county website and start a civil case against anyone for any reason. But you have the burden of proof. The state is not going to provide or collect evidence for you. As opposed to criminal court, where if somebody gets charged, it is the state's job to do that. All right, let's talk about Jane and John. What's going on with Jane and John? Do you agree? Is this a civil matter and not a criminal matter? Okay, how come?
There's no like public.
Okay. What would turn it into a criminal matter? So we're assuming, okay, so he's a key, so he's not technically breaking in. He takes items that he believes belong to him. What would turn this criminal?
If they don't actually want.
Absolutely. If the items don't belong to him. If there's a protection order or something in place, if there's trespassing, if John's already been told you are not allowed to come back here, or you will get trespassed. If in the divorce proceedings, they've already decided this is what's mine and this is what yours, and John says, screw that, I'm going to come take this anyway, then he's in contempt of court, right? So we have this overlap. The divorce proceedings and deciding what belongs to whom is a civil matter. But if you don't follow that, you're getting into criminal territory because you can actually get charged with the crime of contempt of court. So there is some overlap there. What else? What could Jane have committed any crimes here? Let's not automatically assume John's the bad guy. Let's say that all of this is true. What could Jane be charged with if it were to rise to a criminal level?
Like if the court were to order Jane to give John the furniture, but she kept it anyway.
Yeah, it's contempt of court. What about things like misusing 911? That sort of stuff. So lots of different directions this could go. We talk about substantive and procedural law. So substantive law is essentially saying, here's what a crime is, here's what makes it a crime, here are the specific acts that go into each crime. And then procedural law is all about how it's supposed to be enforced. This is things like arrest, search, seizure. You're supposed to read your Miranda rights if you get arrested, all that kind of stuff. A lot of today is just going to be terms, so it's boring and I apologize, but we're going to make it fun. We're gonna do some fun stuff. More Latin. Who loves Latin? Yeah, no, nobody? That's fine. Took Latin in high school because that's a thing that used to happen in high schools, and I don't remember any Latin whatsoever other than this stuff. So two different things have to be present, the motive and the act. We're going to start with the motive. Mens rea is a guilty mind. There has to be intent. There has to be motive for something to be considered a crime. So intent is the purposeful act or the state of mind, and motive is the reason. Who knows who this guy is? Come on, really? Huh?
Hannibal.
Yeah, Hannibal Lecter, also played by Mads Mikkelsen. So this is Sir Anthony Hopkins. Everyone knows who Anthony Hopkins is, right? Come on. If you don't, you should, because he's just an absolute delight. He's like this actor who's a brilliant, brilliant actor, does Shakespeare, does all kinds of stuff, but he's just like this super kooky old man. Like his entire Twitter is him playing piano with his cat, and it's just delightful. Why aren't you working? This is fun. I love this game. Ah, nope. Let's play a game called Where Do I Find the Link? Any ideas? Who knows how to use Google Slides?
Looks like
It's not a picture. It's a video link. It was a video link, I swear. I hate this game. We even put a note here about where to start. Okay, fine. Let's do. I don't even know what to call this scene. Oh, here we go. He does such a good job. Guy's a genius. Is there sound? Is sound gonna happen? Where do we want to start this? There's Hannibal. Has everyone seen Silence of the Lambs? You should. It's a great film. It was in like 1989, but a lot of the stuff that's happening in that film in terms of like the way the police interact and the way that like Clarice is treated is very much relevant. Really. Face out of here. Let's skip to the part that's relevant. Maybe. Is this the right clip? Nope. Let's look at last year's and see if the link works. Whoa. Nope, we're gonna skip that. That's not the correct thing. Nope, sure didn't. Apparently this is the day where nothing is working the way that I want it to work. No. Let's see. 2 book editions ago. Pretty sure we used the same link. We have great internet here. Oh, come on. Really?
I didn't click on it through the slides.
You're smart. See, you could have said that like 3 minutes ago.
I don't know if it's gonna work.
I mean, I should know how it works, but I clearly don't.
But it was.
Yeah. This guy. What's this? You're slowing me down here. You gonna play a video for me? You gonna do the insert video thing and actually work? Also, I fried my computer, and this is not my computer, and I made all of these originally on a Mac, so there's a good chance. Fine, whatever. We'll watch Anthony Hopkins another day. Tried to make it fun, that's okay. So mens rea is the guilty mind, actus reus is the guilty deed. This is the act itself. So in order to have criminal liability, we need to have both. And ironically enough, saying that you didn't know the law is not considered a valid defense. So some contradiction there. Has to be voluntary, overt, or intentional failure to act, where there is a legal duty to do so. So difference between me not feeding a random child on the street versus not feeding my own child. One of those is an act where I have a legal duty to do so. That is criminal. The other is not. I already did that one. Felonies versus misdemeanors. These tend to be, basically felonies are more serious. Every state is different in terms of how we define them, but in general, according to your book, felonies are offenses that are punishable by death or have a possible sentence of more than 1 year. Misdemeanors are less serious. typically punishable by incarceration for less than 1 year. Other big difference is that felonies often go to state prison. Misdemeanors tend to stay at a local jail, like a county jail or municipal jail. There are some exceptions. For example, you can be held for treatment for a misdemeanor under Oregon Revised Statute 161370. If you are found unable to aid and assist, and you can get held without being formally, well, charged, but without being formally convicted. Used to be up to a year, now it's only 90 days because the state hospital ran out of room. So we also like to change the law kind of based on, you know, convenience and logistics and funding and all those kinds of things. Let's look at some differences in Oregon. Read this wall of text. Strangulation, ORS 161187. And when you're done reading the wall of text, tell me when it's a misdemeanor and when it's a felony. Also, that typo is on the state legislator website. I copied and pasted this, so someone should call them and complain. They would love that. All right, who wants to volunteer? Somebody, what's your name? Sean. All right, so Sean, you strangled somebody. Who got strangled? Who's the strangling victim? I was going to ask someone to volunteer, but if you want to choose someone, please be my guest. That's a fun experiment. Yeah. Well, yeah. So who's next to you? What's your name? Emma. So you strangled Emma. Okay. Yeah, way to go, dude. Why? So you strangled Emma, and first we define what strangling means. Applying pressure on the throat, neck, or chest of the other person, blocking the nose or mouth, blah, 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 blah. So we first have to define what strangling means. Then, does not apply to legitimate medical or dental procedures or good faith practices of what? Of religious belief. I don't know what that means. If you strangle somebody for Jesus, that's fine. I don't know what that means, but it's apparently, it's in the law, so whatever. Good faith practices though, so it has to be like an established religious practice. I didn't write it. This comes straight from the legislature. Is it a misdemeanor? So you strangled Emma. Is that a misdemeanor or felony? Okay. How do you feel about that, Emma? Yeah. Seems like it could be, you know, a little more serious, right? When does it become a felony? Yep. Not underage, but under 10. So you can strangle an 11-year-old, that's a misdemeanor. You strangle a 10-year-old, felony. Again, I didn't write it. It's come straight from the legislature. I have no idea how they decide this. Let's say you and Emma live together. You are household members. Now it's a felony. That's domestic violence. You strangle a stranger, you see Emma on the street, you strangle the shit out of her, misdemeanor. You live with her, that's a felony. Don't ask me why, but that is what the law says the difference is. If you do it in front of a child, right? Save the children. If there's a minor child residing within the household, random kid on the street, still a misdemeanor. Emma's kid sees it, that's a felony. If you threaten to use a weapon or if you use a weapon, strangle with your hand, stranger, misdemeanor. Strangle her with her own scarf, felony. So, I mean, we're laughing, but like, this is the reality. Like if you are charging somebody, you had better get those details right because that is going to make a huge difference in whether or not that person gets convicted. If I charge them with misdemeanor and it's really a felony strangulation, those are two different things. That's going to get thrown out because I, the prosecutor, did it wrong.
Even if you undershoot it?
Yep. Yep. Judge is going to say, that's not even correct. Why would you say it's a misdemeanor? You know, that's not what they did. Sometimes procedurally, depending on the county, you can go back and say, oh, well, blah, blah, blah. Or let's say you charge them with the felony and they plead down to a misdemeanor. Those things happen. But You want to get it right. You want to know exactly what the law says. You want to know those nuances, right? Was it with a weapon? Was it with the hands? Was it at home? Was it a stranger? Was there a child watching? Those small details make a difference with what you're actually charging the person with, and that's where due process comes in. So factually, you strangled Emma. Procedurally, we got to figure out what kind of strangulation. We got to figure out how long you're going to jail for, all that stuff. According to this, what is the punishment? Hit number 6. Oh, we missed one. If it's not the first time you strangled Emma, then it becomes a felony. That is there under E. Yeah, 4E. Yep, or if Emma's pregnant. Yep, that's another one. But judge, I didn't know she was pregnant. Too bad, felony. So number 6, what does it say the punishment is? Have you heard about the sentencing grid before? This is in local news a lot. Oregon is one of the few states that has very, very, very strict sentencing guidelines. And every single one, and we'll look at this, later in the term, and we'll see what the sentencing guidelines actually look like. But every single crime in Oregon is going to categorize it at a certain level. So they consider strangulation to be category 5, and then you'll see a sentencing grid based on things like the person's history. Category 5, bam, however many months that is on the grid. So the reason that they word it this way is because the sentencing grid can change. So instead of going through every single law and changing the punishment written in the law and saying like, oh, that's 90 months or that's 36 months, we say, oh, look at the sentencing grid, because then we only have to change one document. So there's some kind of procedural stuff happening there to pay attention to. Types of crimes. According to your book. Anybody not know what any of these mean? We're going to go through them all, but crimes against persons are anything involving other people. There's a person who is a victim and it involves some sort of harm, threat, or force. Oregon has a very, very useful list of what we consider to be, come on, really? Yeah, that one. Crimes against person. Here is our list. Most states have something similar, but we lay it out real easy. Notice the numbers. So RS 163 is going to refer to crimes against person, so on and so forth. They are organized in a way that is logical. Not all of these are crimes, obviously. RS 163-135 right here is a piece of legislation that was created in response to other issues and basically just goes through and says, here's when we would be able to use that defense. So lots of crimes that we consider person-to-person crimes in Oregon. Here's another example of just piece of legislation, hey, we screwed up. We need to go back and clarify some things. Very, very long list. Oregon is one of the only states that has invasion of privacy laws. Keep that in mind when you decide to videotape people being sketchy. You can videotape people being sketchy, but don't videotape people in their private residence being sketchy. And don't be creepy. That's really what it's there for, is if you want to be creepy. Oregon is also one of the few states that consider stalking a person-to-person crime. And then they go through and define every single one of these, right? So you want to know what homicide is, you can read this and figure out the definition, difference between aggravated murder as opposed to less aggravated murder, all those kinds of things here. All Oregon law is available on the OregonLegislature.gov website in case people really want to nerd out. Great resource for when you do papers in your projects to read the legislation directly so you know exactly what it says. Robbery is considered a crime against persons in Oregon because. Get out of here. Anybody actually use polls on Zoom? Is that a thing? So robbery as opposed to burglary. Robbery is when you are taking it from the person specifically or using intimidation to take something from a person. So if I steal something off of your person, that is robbery, as opposed to if I break into your home and you're not home, that's burglary. See the distinction? Yeah. One is a crime against person, the other is a crime against property. Aggravated assault, we put that in there because there are lots of different types of assault. In Oregon, we have like 6 or 7. And then there are levels. There's assault 1, assault 2, assault 3, aggravated assault, so on and so forth. Just like we have murder, aggravated murder, and essentially it's looking at the circumstances around it. And here they are defining it by using its own sort of circular word. And they're saying, oh, well, what makes it aggravated is it causes aggravated bodily injury. And it has to be for the purpose of doing that, which is not the same as, say, something like an assault where you're not trying to hurt the person, but you accidentally do. Or an assault where you're just assaulting the person, but it doesn't result or have the potential to result in some sort of severe aggravated bodily injury. So this is the difference between slapping somebody and like cutting their leg off or whatever, strangling them, which is its own thing. No. Homicide. Homicide is used to refer to any taking of a human life. That includes things that we consider to be justifiable or excusable. So some examples here. If you are in a war and you shoot someone and they are shooting at you, that is still homicide by definition. You've taken a human life, but it's considered justifiable. You're probably not going to be charged with that. And this is anything that's considered to be socially acceptable. Self-defense gets a little sticky depending on the state, the jurisdiction, and how they define it. Legal state or federal executions. Obviously, we don't charge the state with a crime when the state kills someone. And another one that gets really, really contentious where a police officer uses lawful lethal force. Keyword here is lawful. These can still show up in civil court. That's what we see oftentimes happening with police-involved shooting. Maybe they don't have the evidence needed to convict them of a crime, the way that that crime is defined, but a judge can still say, you know, 50-50 plus a feather, responsible for this death, you can get a wrongful death lawsuit, those kinds of things. Excusable homicide. So this is homicide where you didn't occur to you that it could cause a death. This is not something like, you know, manslaughter due to a DUI or things like that, because you are expected to know in those cases that this could cause a death. These are things that are actually completely accidental. So things like malpractice. Case a couple years ago where a guy ran over a kid in the driveway. Terrible, sad case. Could also be put in civil court, just like malpractice could be sent to civil court, but those are considered excusable because they were actually completely accidental. And then of course, criminal homicide, this is murder and manslaughter. Another nifty, very useful diagram from your book. Your book isn't great with a lot of things, but it is really, really, really amazing with charts and putting a lot of complex information into really concise organizational things. So this is a good chart to have if, you know, if you have an exam question that says, hey, this is the situation. What type of murder is this and why? You pull out your little chart. So every single one of these is criminal homicide, but notice that there are 5 different kinds. Not every state has felony murder. So felony murder is, let's say you are trying to rob someone and they accidentally die, whatever that looks like. You committed a felony, but then it led to an accidental death. That can automatically bump you up to 1st-degree murder, even if you did not mean to kill that person. I really like the examples here because it seems like the author was maybe going through some stuff with his wife when he wrote this. Yeah, there's some, he's got some thoughts about all of that. Really specific ones too, like really descriptive, like yeah. He's got some trouble. Poor Mr. Peak. What's his name? Kenneth Peak. Poor Kenny. Crimes against person. This is another really, really contentious one because the definitions change over time, and the definitions change based on our culture and what we decide is acceptable and what is not acceptable. So fairly recently, sadly, we removed the word forcible from the federal definition with the FBI, 2013, 10 years ago. Historically, this also did not include sexual assaults of anyone that wasn't a woman and other types of non-contact sex crimes. So Oregon has lots and lots and lots of extremely specific sex crimes that were all, you saw the list, and it goes through and defines the difference between all of those. Oregon is one of the states where it is really, really, really difficult to get a rape charge and prosecution that will stick. More often than not, people end up with something like unlawful penetration, 1st degree, 2nd degree, 3rd degree. I have opinions about that, but we're not going to share them. But it is just kind of an interesting thing. Some states are more likely to charge people with rape, others are not. Our modern definition is any, you know, we refer to this instead as sexual assault. So any sexual act that does not include a person's consent, no limitation on age, gender, relationships, so on and so forth. Can also include non-contact sex crimes. So non-consensual pornography, there's your privacy laws, which again in Oregon is one of the few states that has those. That also includes things like consensual pornography that you then share without consent of the other person. You're going to go to jail. Don't do it. Also, it's wrong, so don't do it, you know. Any questions about sex crimes? Crimes against property. Burglary, we already talked about that. Larceny or theft, they mean the exact same thing, but some states call it larceny, others call it theft. Grand larceny sounds like way cooler than grand theft, but you know, whatever. Motor vehicle theft and arson. Oregon is one of the few states in which arson is a measure 11. You will get a felony A for arson, which is the same as murder. You burn down a building, you are going to prison for just as long as killing somebody. So keep that in mind. Don't burn anything down. It is one of the only crimes against property that is sentenced at the same level as crimes against person.
Are there any like, what's the arson or is it all just
Arson.
burn down a old abandoned building is the same as like
Yep.
burning down?
Yep. There is a charge, I don't remember the exact name. It's like unintentional fire, blah, 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 blah. And I've seen that used for somebody who's say like building a fire to keep themselves warm and it spreads. But I've also seen people like that get charged with arson. So it really comes down to the discretion of the officers, the prosecutor, all that kind of stuff. But arson itself in Oregon, there's arson and that's it. Public order offenses. So these are things that we find to be offensive in society, things that we would call victimless crimes. Yeah. Things that we typically associate with morality, where ideally there isn't necessarily a victim. No one is being directly harmed. There might be people being indirectly harmed, but there is no direct harm to another person or another person's property. These are the things that tend to be re-legislated frequently. An example would be different types of substances, both at the state and federal level. How many people here are cool with marijuana being legalized? You can be honest. It's actually a pretty small number, not representative, because in the United States, it's about 80-something%. 20 years ago, it was about 30-something%. So we see a shift, and as a result of that shift, we see changes in legislation. That tends to happen with public order offenses. Same things with stuff like sex work, gambling, all those kinds of things. White collar crime. If you're rich, you get your own special category. This also tends to be things that are happening. So both white collar crime and organized crime were crimes that weren't created or written until they needed to be. So before we had a stock market, we didn't talk about white collar crime because it didn't exist. So it kind of became its own category because of its place in history as well. These are things that people tend to happen in the course of somebody's job, professional crime, that kind of stuff. Organized crime is when it is organizational. So gang stuff, mafia stuff. It could be person-on-person crime, but it's when it's done in an organization for the purpose of that organization. So if I kidnap you and demand a ransom to pay for, to say, well, you got to let my buddy off over here for this thing that he did because we're in the same club, that's organized crime. Putting here, another video that's not going to work. Cool. I'll post these online. Maybe. Nope. Wait. Defenses. So you get charged with a crime, you get to have a defense, right? That whole due process thing, innocent until proven guilty, so on and so forth. Different types of offenses. Defenses, yeah. Really? Oh, wait. Remember we talked about excusable and justifiable homicide. Same terminology can be used for other types of defenses, particularly if you are pleading guilty. So affirmative or conditional defenses are saying, I'm guilty, but it was self-defense, right? Yeah, I shot the guy. He broke into my house. I was in fear for my life, so on and so forth. You can also attempt to use other types of mitigating reasons like mental illness, committing a crime under duress, made a mistake, intoxication. Okay, or I did the thing, fully guilty, but I want a lighter sentence, and here's why I think I deserve a lighter sentence. So those are affirmative or conditional defenses. Don't try to stop a fleeing felon. That doesn't work in Oregon. There's very few places where it works, but it definitely doesn't work here. Also, it's just not safe, so don't do it. Justification defenses. So self-defense. Every state has different laws about self-defense. You should know your state laws. Does anybody know Oregon's law? No? Okay, go home and look it up and then email me and get a bonus point. Necessity. So the way that we can really look at something like self-defense is, the level of force necessary, right? If somebody's like 300 feet away and they're running at me, I'm probably not going to get away with shooting them. If they're 300 feet away and they're running at me with a gun, then that might be considered necessity because the potential harm is greater. And then duress is if not acting on free will. Excuse defenses. So if you are under the age of 7, you are considered too young to form the requisite mens rea. What is mens rea again? What's that?
Motive.
Yep, motive and intent. So the criminal mind. Diminished capacity. Your book lists this under intoxication. We don't see it used often with intoxication unless it's something like a medication. You can't say, sorry, I murdered them, I was drunk. Probably not going to work. This could be something like having a very serious medical issue. Encephalitis, your brain is swollen. You legitimately didn't know what you were doing. Medication issues. All sorts of things there. There are lots of different ways for measuring diminished capacity. We're going to talk about that a little bit more later in the term. I have a psychologist that's going to come in who's one of his jobs is to measure things like diminished capacity and whether or not people can be held criminally liable based on things like their mental illness. Entrapment would be an excuse defense. Sorry, judge, I did this thing, but I only did it because I was coerced into doing it by the police. And then mental illness or insanity. Also double jeopardy, but sorry, judge, you can't charge me with this because somebody else already did. Yeah. Things get kind of tricky there. We do have an entirely separate court for people under the age of 18, which there's a whole unit just on juvenile court. And if you do something at 5 or 6 years old, it doesn't mean that there's no consequence, right? You might get put into some sort of children's system for treatment, but you're not going to be charged with an actual crime.
Is that like still going on a record?
It depends. If it goes on a medical record, then only people who have access to your medical record see it. If it goes on your juvenile record, it stays on your juvenile record until you turn 18. And then in some states that gets completely erased. In some states you can ask to have it erased. Depends on the crime. In Oregon, if you commit a Measure 11 offense as a juvenile, that stays with you, but all non-Measure 11 offenses don't. And even then you can request that it be expunged or sealed. And you have to, there's like a whole separate process for that. We'll talk about that more when we get to the juvenile section. We're gonna have some folks from Juvie come in and chat with y'all. In Oregon, here are your options. These are the only pleas that you get to make. Guilty, I did it. I did it the way they said that I did it. I strangled Emma at the felony level. Not guilty. Sure, I strangled Emma, but it was only a misdemeanor and you're charging me with a felony. No contest. Not going to say if I did it or not. You guys got to look at the evidence. Guilty except insanity. I strangled Emma because I have a specific mental illness that qualifies under Oregon Revised Statutes 161 and a direct result of my mental illness. It can't just be that you have a mental illness. The crime itself has to be a direct result of that. For example, what's the name? First mass shooter in Oregon. And I should know his name because he was on my unit a long time ago. We called him One Scoop, but I'm trying to remember his actual name. He was One Scoop because he worked in the kitchen and everybody only got one scoop. This fellow was very, 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 very ill. What is his name? I can picture his face too. Is he still alive? Pattern shooter. It's like right on the tip of my tongue. Oh, yeah, we know, 1981, blah, blah, blah. What's your name? He does not look like that anymore. Nope, that's the victim. Lawrence Moore, Mr. Moore. Yep, Larry Moore. So Larry Moore, Salem Tavern shooter, severe schizophrenia. Get to you in a second. really severe schizophrenia. By the time I met this gentleman, he was completely nonverbal, just completely in his own head. Very, very, very sick man. He shut up the Salem Tavern because he had a delusional belief that they were poisoning his food. That was part of his schizophrenia. However, he did not qualify for guilty except insanity because at that time, and this is 1981, he skipped over certain people while he was shooting. And so the judge determined that he was not so mentally ill that he couldn't decipher right from wrong. In his mind, he was only shooting the people that he believed were poisoning him because, again, of his delusional belief, because of his schizophrenia. But because there's this additional idea of, did he have the frame of mind? Was it intentional? Was he able to distinguish and know? This is that diminished capacity. He had the capacity to know who he was shooting and who he wasn't. They found him actually guilty. So he's in prison as opposed to the state hospital. That would probably not happen today because we have a much better understanding of that illness and of that case. But that is what happened to Larry Moore. And he is still at this prison unless he's dead. And I don't actually know because I haven't seen him in a few years. What's your name? Okay. Absolutely. You can also plead guilty to get a plea bargain. That's the majority of people plead guilty because they get a plea bargain. I'm going to plead guilty in exchange for you dropping these charges or giving me a lighter sentence, kind of thing.
So like the judge is the one that's.
You put in a plea, and then the judge or the jury has to accept that plea, depending on if you choose a jury trial or a bench trial.
But who's to say like the judge is an expert on it?
So that's where it gets really tricky. If you read, you don't need to, but if you wanted to really nerd out, Oregon Revised Statute 161 lays all of that out. It has a list of who gets to make that assessment, how often that assessment is made, what are the qualifying diagnoses, how are we actually going to define diminished capacity, all that kind of stuff. So like part of my job at the state hospital, part of that chapter is for folks that have been convicted, adjudicated guilty except insanity, and they're sentenced under psychiatric state review board to treatment instead of prison. Part of our job is to reassess them every year and decide, are they safe to go to a lower level of care? Is this person safe based on their current treatment to go to the community, to go to a group home, that kind of thing. We also have forensic evaluators whose job it is to decide things like, are you even capable of standing trial? ORS 161370 is our, wow, words are hard. Our law that determines whether or not you have the capability to go through court, whether or not you're able to aid and assist in your own defense based on things like mental illness or disability. There's an assessment for that. And you get reassessed. So you get assessed if there's any suspicion that you are unable to go through court under that law. Your attorney, your defense attorney would put in for an assessment. You go to the state hospital, you get assessed by a psychologist in the community, specific psychologists. They're designated by the state. There's additional certifications that you go through to become a forensic evaluator. They do a big, long assessment. They look at your whole history and they determine whether or not you have the capacity to go to court. If you don't, you go to treatment for a while. This is where we were talking about that whole, like, you can be locked up even if you haven't actually been convicted yet, because you can be locked up in a secure treatment facility while you're getting treatment until your capacity is restored. And then once your capacity is restored, your case starts over again. So, and that can happen at any time, right? You could make it all the way through your trial and then sentencing comes along and you start having really intense mental health symptoms, or something happens with your medication, or you stop your medication, which is a thing people do sometimes because they're like, I don't want to get sentenced. I want to go to the state hospital. Doesn't work for real long. We get a certain amount of time to give you treatment to restore your capacity to go through the court system. And then as soon as that is restored, you are going straight back to jail and straight back to court to figure out what's going to happen with your case. There are instances, 161426, I believe, is the revised statute. Let's say you commit a crime, but you never are able to go through trial. Let's say you murdered somebody and we know that you murdered somebody. There's a video, there's all kinds of evidence, but you are so ill and you can't get your capacity restored within the allotted amount of time. You don't just get to go free. You can actually be adjudicated. Well, you won't be adjudicated guilty except insanity. You would get what's called 426 because that's the name of the law. And they say basically this person is so dangerous based on their disability or their mental illness that they're going to have to go to treatment anyway, as if they were adjudicated guilty except insanity. That's really tough to do. I've only seen it happen like twice. In both were murder cases. So it has to be, there's a certain list of crimes. If it's something like trespassing and you never are restored and able to go through court, they're like, whatever, it usually gets dropped. But there is a specific list of crimes, including things like murder, sexual assault, manslaughter, certain things that even if you are so ill that you can't go through court, if you did it and you are considered too dangerous to be released in the community, you will still be treated as guilty except insanity, even if you're never actually adjudicated. So that's a thing. Another video that we can't watch. I mean, that's the thing, right? It is 8:12. You don't have to sit here for 18 minutes and think about the videos that I timed for exactly 18 minutes. I want to just throw it out there. You won't be responsible for them. These are all just examples that would be used for discussion. So you can leave. Sorry for the technical difficulties. And next week, we know that if the door is locked, somebody call campus safety and they will come and lock it. Now, I am in private practice because fuck that noise. How do I turn this on? I'm a licensed clinical social worker and I have a master's in public health. So I'm a director at a mental health clinic.